So we are really excited to have Madeline Bright, the Executive Director of Earth Sangha, with us here today. And with that, I am going to stop sharing and let you share, Maddie.
All right, thank you so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. And so, yeah, I'm really looking forward to today. I'm really hoping to leave a good amount of time for the question and answer sort of portion of the day. I think that that should be really interesting. I did put this presentation together with the understanding that we would have a lot of people here from a lot of different places, and just, seeing the responses in chat. It looks like we have people all up and down the eastern seaboard of North America. Obviously our work is done in Fairfax County in Virginia. So a lot of the examples that I'll talk about are really around, Fall Zone, Piedmont, Intercoastal Plain, parts of Virginia, and really interacting with the sort of urban suburban sort of complex therein. But I think a lot of this applies to more rural areas, more natural areas, as well as areas not right in here. So without further ado, let's jump in. So I think I know a number of names in chat who may already be familiar with our work, but if you're not, at Earth Sangha, we are an exclusively local ecotype native plant nursery. That is our core program. At our nursery, which is really only about an acre and a quarter, so a pretty small container yard, everything that we have there, all the species we grow, are from seed that we collect from local sources with permission. And then we distribute those back out, either to private gardens, to homeowners, HOAs, faith organizations, as well as to public lands projects. We grow more than 300 species. All told, I think it's closer to 350, though at any given time we may only have about 250 species in cultivation. To put that number in perspective, there are about 1,200 native vascular plant species native to Fairfax County. So we grow a pretty tidy little slice of our native flora. And on a good year, we distribute somewhere in the realm of about 65,000 plants from our nursery. So, it's a pretty modest size thing, but we're involved in a lot of small to medium scale restoration projects across our region. So when we talk about what restoration is, and I know that a lot of folks here may already be practitioners of restoration. I saw some of the comments that people had sent in ahead of time, are very detailed sort of technique, sort of focused things. But for folks who are starting out, who want to get involved in this sort of field, whether that's as volunteers, whether that's as professionals, I think it's good to kind of think about what some of our goals and what even we're thinking about is and isn't restoration. So I think it's good, we don't have to say do no harm altogether, though obviously that's what I put on the slide. But I think the idea of having a sort of precautionary component to our practice, right? So at any time that we go out into a wild area, that comes with some cost. We are creating some disturbance. I'll go into later why I think that writ large, people should be more active in managing our natural landscapes. But it's important to recognize that it comes with a cost, right? I think that the best thing you can do for restoration success, and again, we'll talk more about the specifics, is to do the prep ahead of time, right? So, this is something where, like, say, hitting up those species sheets that Blue Ridge PRISM creates, that we refer folks to all the time, is a really, really important tool to making sure that your restoration, that your replanting is a success. And that is to make sure that you kill the non-native invasive vegetation first and do that thoroughly. When we move to actually restoring, that is getting native plants back in, a big difference between sort of a more gardening with native sort of mindset and outcome versus a restoration sort of outcome is how you source and the provenance of those plants. So I'm a really big believer that we want to use as locally sourced plants as possible. We want to be working towards some kind of native plant community. And ideally, we want to use plants that are kind of, in the happy medium there. So generally, really common species will come right back onto a site. Those are not necessarily targets for restoration because they don't need our help. And also, and we'll talk more about this, you know, there are a lot of rare species that are exciting to see and fun, but they can be really difficult to reestablish. They can be difficult to work with. They can be hard to get back into the same kind of niche and the same kind of habitat. And so we don't want to over rely on those things. And in an ideal scenario, you're working with some kind of reference site, you're working with an understanding of local plant community ecology, that you are building towards something that might naturally occur absent the kind of replanting you're doing. So I like to think about restoration as moving us along a succession curve a little bit faster than the site would do on its own. That's true of our meadows and grasslands and prairies, as well as our forested systems, as well as our wetland systems. You know, let's take these sites, move them along out of a relatively low diversity, low ecological value sort of stage, and hurry them along to a higher diversity, higher ecological value sort of end state. I think it's really important when doing restoration. And the reason I think it's important is because a lot of times when you're doing restoration, you are not in control of all your variables. You cannot control the rainfall. You cannot control your soil types. Again, it's very different from gardening, and gardening already, you don't control all of these variables. So you really have to grapple with what the site hands you. And I think that's a really central component. So because of that, I think it's important that you define success. And I think that a definition of success is going to be different depending on your site. So if you are working in the context of, say, an HOA community grounds, and you do not have full buy-in, or you're hoping to create buy-in through your project, you know, spending time on design, spending time on making sure that there are native species there that people read as you know, gardeny things, or, you know, think of as an attractive space. You know, creating overlap between ecological function and human use of the landscape, all of those could play into a successful restoration. I think that opens the door to a lot of interesting land use. It's not just having a bench and things like that. It could be things like food forests and other kind of land uses like that, that are still a higher ecological value than an invaded, degraded state, but are nonetheless something that is appealing to human use, right? It could also mean, you know, going all the way through and saying, I want it to look exactly like this reference site, and we're going to keep plugging away until it looks like a high quality, well-established prairie or a high quality forest. And that's absolutely a good goal too. But in any case, one of the things that I want to see as a plant grower, as someone who replants a lot of things, is I'm looking for that second generation of our restoration to come through. So I don't just want to put plants in there and have them survive. I want them to reproduce. I want that population to stabilize. We've seen this in, say, a lot of seed established meadows where, for whatever reason, insufficient site prep and over reliance on seed, and we'll talk about that, that we see sites that are dependent on constant inputs in terms of their plants. I don't think that that's a very tenable solution, that we want to make these sites where eventually, yeah, there's going to be ongoing management, but you're not constantly adding plants to the site, that you eventually graduate out of that. Having then a really resilient and sort of ecologically functional landscape, you know, I think is a goal regardless of the kind of restoration that you're approaching, whatever the endpoint might be, whatever the human uses might be. We want to see resilient spaces in large part because we want to be able to get through environmental stressors. And I think it's really important to recognize that a lot of these environmental stressors are going to get worse as climate change continues. There's a lot of research. There is a paper in Nature that was published, I think, in 2020 or 2021, that was looking at both climate anomalies and rainfall anomalies, temperature anomalies. And what they found is really since 1980, the amount of years or the amount of months that we are setting new records, seeing things outside of a normal range of what you would expect in an area has really accelerated. So I think it's very fair to say, based on some of that research, that since about 1980, we have not been in our historical climate anymore. We're in something new. And that is driving invasives, it's driving pests and pathogens, it's driving stressors on a lot of our trees, like our mature, especially white oaks, are in decline, in large part because of these sort of climate stressors that are made worse in an urban and a suburban environment. So, restoring back to something that is more resilient is a really, really important component of restoration. One of the ways that we can build resiliency is by reconnecting habitat. This research, this was done by Ellen Domshin. She published in 2019. This is an open access paper. I don't have a link in here. I can send that to the Blue Ridge folks to distribute. But if you Google Ellen Domshin, it's spelled in the slide, in 2019, you can pull up this paper. It is really, really, I think, interesting. It's fascinating, and it contains some good news. One of the things that she and her team found is that even tenuously connected habitat post-disturbance is more resilient. So they lost fewer species through a disturbance event, and they recovered a lot quicker. So the name of the game in restoration really needs to be to reconnect habitat to each other. We're very lucky in a lot of parts of the country, and indeed a lot of parts of the world, that things like, say, stream valley parks, large amounts of public land in conservation, like our bigger parks, can serve as these sort of sources for ecological diversity, and we can build off of those to build further connections. There's this concept in ecology called sort of source and sink sort of models. The idea is that big spaces are more static, that in good years you may see big populations of whether it's plants or animals or things like that, that then are spilling over into sources that are sinks that aren't as stable because they aren't as built up, they aren't as ecologically well developed yet, they aren't as late successional, if you will, or some of them are simply too small. But nonetheless, that's important habitat. So say, you have a big mast year of something, say you have a lot of extra viburnums fruiting one year because we actually get some fall rain for once. That could mean that a lot of our migratory birds are doing better the following year because they really depend on that. And maybe they raise more chicks. Not all of those chicks can grow up to live just in the extent protected parks. Those nesting sites may already be taken, right? So that means having nearby other sites is an important sort of spillover. And over time, those sinks can become sources of their own if they're built up and recreated. So this really gives us a kind of ecological model, if you will, for how restoration in small spaces done over and over again can create a more resilient landscape and help shore up populations, even in our larger parks and things like that, without having to go back into them necessarily. If you look at a sort of landscape scale, now this research was done in Europe, but I think the takeaways are applicable to North America. What they find is that kind of reconnection and that kind of resiliency that connection builds does not have to be the exact same habitat type. So that is to say, we can make our forest habitats stronger and more resilient and more reconnected without having to necessarily plant more forest. We could create more prairies or more savannas. We could shore up wetland habitat nearby. And really, that sort of pattern of landscape use, where you have a more heterogeneous sort of pattern of landscape use, and again, we're talking about still natural uses, right? I don't mean that sort of paving a section of forest is somehow beneficial for our natural areas, because it's obviously not. But having pockets of different landscape can lead to a more diverse and more resilient habitat. This is, of course, there's some nuance here, right? So, for instance, in Fairfax County, our largest meadow, which is undergoing restoration right now, it's burn managed. It is a pretty successful state right now. There are still things to address, but that's Elk Lick Park out in the Chantilly area, for those of you who know our geography here. That's about 40 acres, and that's the largest open natural meadow space in the county. That has now attracted bobwhite quail back to it. There may be breeding populations. You can certainly hear them calling if you get there at the right time of the year, early enough in the day. And that is phenomenal. That is a species of bird that is dependent on higher quality grasslands that are of a certain size. They can't come to small grasslands. So that's a big restoration success. But if you start reading up on grassland nesting birds, you will find that there are other species that would require more than double the amount of space. There are species where ornithologists are saying we really need 100 acres of grassland to accommodate some of these things to come back. I don't think that's something that can be accommodated at Elk Lick. That would mean the loss of a lot of forest. It would probably mean having to buy additional property, and certainly there's nothing in the budget for that. But it is a reminder that there are species that require a lot of habitat. So when you're thinking about wildlife targets, that may be something to think about. When they embarked on that restoration at Elk Lick, they actually cut down a lot of trees to open up that meadow and create one large contiguous meadow instead of a series of patchwork meadows. And at the time they did that, there was some pushback. There was thinking that, say some of the prairie warblers and things like that that were nesting along those edges might be left out. But that is kind of the tension of kind of land use. We've talked about this or introduced that a little bit before. That there is really no free lunch when it comes to that disturbance. Sometimes a few of these things are zero sum. We still do have those warblers at Elk Lick. I do not know population numbers for them. I'm not an ornithologist. But I would say that getting those the bobwhite back in is probably of more importance because there are a lot of other grassland habitat that's suitable for those prairie warblers, which can exist along a lot of those kind of edges with Virginia pine and eastern red cedar transitioning into grassland, where we need a big expanse to do that for the bobwhite, that is. Oh, sorry. And I meant to mention too that these sort of patchworks of the landscape are historically and prehistorically what we had in Eastern North America. So in Virginia, or what's now Virginia, there's good archaeological evidence of indigenous peoples settling here around 14,000 years ago. We did not have a modern climate 14,000 years ago. Virginia probably looked a little bit more like, say, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It was a lot colder. So a lot of our landscape here co-evolved with what indigenous people were doing to the landscape. And chiefly among them, they were burning it. And we had a lot more grassland, a lot more prairie space. These were climax communities that were fire managed. And we had the fauna to support that as well. We had bison here. There were bison in Washington, D.C. as late as the 1700s before they were extirpated. That whole subspecies is now extinct. We had elk here as well. Eastern North America is broadly deficient, somewhere in the realm of like 12 to 60 million beaver. Those would have been clearing wet forests, turning them into marshland. And then as those dams collapsed and beaver populations move from site to site, that marshland would be regenerating back to forest. So we would have had a lot more churn, a lot more variability. The historical and anthropological and ecological views about what Eastern North America looked like historically has really evolved. So I don't think that you'll find as many people who make the argument as you've seen in generations past, that a squirrel could have traveled from Florida to Ontario without ever touching the ground tree to tree. That is not the case, or at least that's not the current historical thinking. Before we jump into sort of the replanting elements, and again, I'm reluctant to focus too much on the species here because I knew that the audience would be kind of broad, but we'll touch a little bit about those things. Our practice has been that natural regeneration of stands is more or less the gold standard on site. That's what we want to see. So you can see here, this is at Lake Fairfax Park. This is, solidly into the Piedmont, beginning of the Triassic Basin and parts of it. Of Fairfax County, and this is phenomenal natural regeneration. None of this was replanted of Quercus alba. This is the kind of stand that honestly would just benefit from some kind of deer caging or deer protection, and nothing else. I wouldn't even go in and thin these things and try and select sort of winning trees earlier. I would just let them sort that out themselves. Over time, they'll grow really straight, really tall, fairly quickly. They'll go through a stem exclusion phase, and a number of the smaller ones that grew a little bit slower will die out, and you'll open back up into a woodland there. This is the kind of site where, you might just kind of see what's happening and fill in some gaps down the road. But anywhere you see really, really good natural regeneration, I think that's a really good site. I should mention, I haven't been back to this site since I took this photo, at least this exact stand. I think there is someone in chat. I think I saw Tony's name on here, who might have been there, and she can fill us in during the Q&A session if indeed this site now needs some help, because we have new stressors arrive all the time, so that kind of monitoring and going back is a really important component. So when we are thinking about sort of replanting, and replanting is really at the crux of restoration, and indeed that's what this talk is supposed to be about, and I've avoided talking about it for 9 slides so far. When we go back and replant, what we want to see are our most common species go back in, or what I sort of think of as sort of our foundation or the sort of backbone. Now I say most common, but I am excluding our most kind of ruderal, disturbance happy sort of things. So in our context here, in most of our sort of mesic, that is medium moisture sort of meadows in the Virginia Piedmont or coastal plain, that means we're thinking about goldenrods or bone sets, some kind of helianthus, our sunflowers, ironweeds like this New York ironweed that I took a photo of at Manassas National Battlefield Park. This is a deep cut. Deep cut is one of our highest quality meadows in our region here in Northern Virginia. These are things that you see repeat themselves a lot over the landscape. It's also important too to get those kind of less showy, less exciting species. For instance, if you're doing meadow replanting, grasses, sedges, rushes, all of those sorts of species are going to be really foundational. I would aim for somewhere between 40 and 60% of all the replanted material going into a meadow or prairie sort of replanting to be a graminoid, depending on the kind of moisture regimes on site and how those things are going to sort themselves out. However, we would avoid the most common sort of species. So when I'm talking about bone set, I'm actually excluding our most common bone set. It's not one we grow, right? So we have about half a dozen or so species of bone set that we grow at our nursery, but we will not touch late bone set, Eupatorium serotinum. It's just too aggressive, and those are the kinds of things that can mess up a site. So again, that kind of middle of the road site, you do want to kind of pull your plant list in terms of what you want to replant from higher quality sites and not the most degraded ones, because that will lend to a lot of kind of very aggressive sort of annual short-lived perennial species. Similarly, in our forest systems, we're looking for things like our oaks, hickories. Those are big targets for conservation for us, and they take a little bit longer to get established. When we are looking at the ecological value of a lot of these species, what the research over and over shows again is that whether we're talking about pollinators like our native allegolectic bees, that is bees that are pollen eaters that are only going to a few species, or we're talking about our lepidopterans, our butterflies and moths and caterpillars and so forth. What we find is that the bulk of those are hosted on relatively common genera. So in meadows, getting asters like Symphiatricum species, sunflower species, goldenrod, silphiums, is really critical to our specialist pollinators, just as we find in our forest setting, getting oaks across a wide range of different forested habitat, getting willows back around here, primarily in wetter habitat, though we do have a couple upland salix species, or even getting some of the earlier successional stuff like prunus species. Black cherry is a very common tree around here, but it's one that we like to use on restoration, both as sort of a nurse tree, because it is not as long-lived as an oak or a hickory, but also because it is a very ecologically valuable tree in terms of the amount of insect herbivores it supports, the amount of birds that eat the fruit. It's a very productive and quick-growing tree. I promised that I would touch a little bit on some of the rare species we grow. So there's my mom there, and we're not talking about the lovely sunflower that's right in front of her in bloom, but the rather more cryptic looking stand that she's holding in her left hand there. That is Solidago rigida. Folks joining us from the Midwest may be surprised to know that that is a state rare plant here in Virginia. It's really known from only a couple sites in Fairfax County and only a handful more across the state. You know, when you're working with these sort of rare species, it can be really, really hard to get the right place to find that niche back for it. If you look at the literature about Solidago rigida, that is stiff goldenrod, some treatments of it use the genus Oleoneuron, by the way. You will find the habitat notes are always very, very dry, often rocky sort of habitat. So that those are the sorts of places we've tried to restore it to. We've had sort of mixed success with that. But those of you, who are eagle-eyed in your Helianthus ID will notice that that sunflower that's growing right by, mixed in with it right in front of my mom there, is Helianthus angustifolius. That's a sunflower of wet meadows, often muddy sort of areas, edges of swamp forests. And indeed, this is kind of a moist mesic stand, and that Solidago rigida stand has been there for decades. So there's kind of a nuance to this, and this is kind of where the art meets the science. Are you trying to line it up with a reference to a reference site where it's occurring, or what the literature from other botanists or things are saying? We've been trying to work with the Park Authority. We'll continue to grow it for Fairfax County Park Authority colleagues, but also identify some sites where we might have a little bit more of a moisture gradient, where we might be looking at more mesic target sites nearby to restore it. I'll mention we're only working with this population in part because that population is quite threatened. There are not a lot of individual plants in it, so you kind of want to see those alley effects, those kind of positive ecological sort of feedback loops, if you will, from having a big population on a site hitting that kind of critical mass. But also it is right above a gas pipeline and underneath a power line easement, so there's the potential for really substantial disturbance on that site. Looking at the Pycnanthemum torii there, that's my wife's hand holding it. That's a taxon that some botanists dispute whether it should even be its own species. There's arguments that it's an unstable hybrid. It only occurs along the northeastern Atlantic seaboard. We're kind of at the southern edge of its range here. It's rare in every single state it occurs in. We have had a real difficulty getting that reestablished in sites, and the parent population was badly damaged by disturbance. So I don't even know if we'll be able to continue to work with that species. It may be going into extirpation in our area, and in fact, broadly as a taxon, it may be headed towards extinction. I attended a talk by the chief botanist of NatureServe a little while ago, and he documented a species that was only known from a single site, and between both clonal work and seed work, they grew over 100,000 individual plants, and tried replanting on a number of different habitats, and that species is now entirely extinct. It simply doesn't exist anymore. Once you get into these really kind of very rare, very disconnected populations, despite a restorationist best efforts, it can be really hard to dig a species out of a very, very deep inbreeding depression. And that's maybe where we are with Pycnanthemum torii, I'm not sure. But it goes to show that protecting the things that we have now from getting out into falling into that very, very rare standpoint. But also one of the best things that we can do is protect these habitats and protect these plants in situ. It can be very hard to reestablish them and to have that population persist. The best intervention is, when working with rare species, almost always to create a better habitat on site, leave the plant in situ, and not have to replant at another location. So when we're talking about sourcing our plants, you now know, okay, hey, great, it would be great to work with, a local reference site. I want to work with reasonably common species, things that are neither too common nor too rare. I think it's really important that you source as locally as possible. We have always been a local ecotype plant nursery. We've always worked with stock that we collected. And one of the things that the chief criticisms of that model that got levied at us, especially many years ago when we were first developing this model, especially when my parents were first developing this model, was either that, oh, well, with dominant species, you see a lot of heterogeneity, or that, oh, we're not collecting enough genetic diversity, that we need to be collecting farther afield. And what really the genetic research has borne out, like this study done in Midwestern states by Miranda Gray, is that if you look at dominant wind-pollinated species, so this is big bluestem, this is a species that we don't work with here. We do have locally native stands of Andropogon gerardii, but they're not a major constituent of our meadows through the Piedmont and coastal plain. And they are very aggressive when brought ex situ into these meadows, and can sort of artificially create monocultures that we don't want to see. But as you move into these tall grass prairie systems, what you see is that big bluestem plays well with others in tall grass prairie systems. It is a dominant species. It may be a plurality of cover on some very healthy, well-established sites even. And what Gray and her team went out and looked at is they found that actually, even at any given tall grass prairie meadow fragment of this species that was long assumed to be more or less homogeneous across wide spaces of its range, because there's so much of it, and because it's spreading pollen all over the place, because it's wind pollinated, that they assumed, oh, okay, well, any given site probably has the same ecotype, and that's probably true of a lot of neighboring sites. Instead, what they found was that a lot of these things across even one site may have multiple ecotypes, and some of them may be kind of co-dominant on site. So each of these colors in the pie chart and in the bar chart below are showing a distinct ecotype. So when I'm talking about an ecotype, I mean a distinct sort of genetic sort of lineage, a distinct sort of genotype of a species that doesn't rise to the level of, say, a subspecies, a variety, or a form. We're talking about a sort of unranked level of diversity. Different people may draw the line in different areas, but what you see here is across some of these things that you may have half a dozen different distinct ecotypes just across one site. So a good collection protocol that gets you moving across the site, collecting from a lot of parent species, is collecting a lot of genetic diversity. And that genetic diversity is really key to building out a resilient landscape. I refer to this a lot because I think there's a lot of interest in moving towards a sort of assisted migration range expansion sort of thing. Like, oh, let's just plant something that's farther south, right? Okay, oh, our USDA ranges are shifting, so let's bring all that flora up. One, by and large, that work has already been done. We've been doing that, but in support of economic activity. So here in Virginia, one of our native species that has had the greatest range expansion is loblolly pine, because loblolly grows quick and you can use it for all sorts of pine wood products. What we don't see with loblolly pine pulled out of the outer coastal plain and dumped throughout the state is a high degree of ecological connections, either with other plants or wildlife. Those monocultural loblolly stands are very low quality stands, what you would sort of expect from a woodlot. Whereas loblolly forests in the right place are diverse and lovely plant communities that support a lot of different wildlife and interact with a lot of different plants and support a lot of plant habitat too. I remain really broadly very skeptical of the idea of range expansion, assisted migration. I think that may be a good choice in specific interventions for specific rare species, but I think as a sort of a mass tool for managing the landscape, that is not where we need to be, and certainly that's not what the research supports at this point. Instead, what we need to be doing is fostering reconnectivity and fostering genetic diversity, and we can do that by working with local or local-ish plants as a backbone component for a lot of our restoration. We also have to think about cultivars. Now, it's absolutely true if you're sourcing seed for large-scale products, or excuse me, large-scale projects, that you're probably going to have to use some amount of cultivar seed. That is simply the reality of large-scale restoration projects, that there's going to be some reliance on material like that. Now, it's true that once you start handling a species and you're sort of going out combine harvesting it at the same time year after year after year, and you're not reintroducing wild genotypes back into that pool, you've probably created a cultivar regardless of what the genetic provenance of that material is anyway. That's from conversations that I've had with professors, say, from Virginia Tech, and some of the reading I've done on the rise of, say, domestication syndromes and sort of accidental domestications and things like that. That said, it's going to be a lot better than doing nothing, especially if you need to get cover on those sites. What the research has shown out in terms of the ecological value of our cultivars versus our wild types, like this research done by Annie White. This was her PhD dissertation, I believe, from the University of Vermont. I went to a presentation that she gave at the National Arboretum a number of years ago. And really what they found, this is a sort of a paired sort of model. They looked at a wild type of a species. Those are all the pale gray lines. And then she looked at common cultivars that could be sourced locally. Her family is also, they're horticulturists as well. So she had a lot of access to these things at her family's business. And they looked at total pollination visitation. They looked at bee-specific visitation and just native bee visitation. And what they found is that the vast majority of the things that they looked at, the wild types were simply getting more pollinator visitation than the cultivar stock. You can see some similarities with cultivars that have been altered very little in terms of their phenotype, like Rudbeckia fulgida goldsturm compared to her local variety of Rudbeckia fulgida, and indeed some increases. So like Veronicastra virginicum lavendelterm was actually bred to attract more pollinators. It has extra purple markings on the flower. What this doesn't tell us is whether that's a sort of beneficial change or not to the landscape. So really the case I kind of tend to make is that when we're deviating from a wild type, if the goal is to have a wild ecosystem, a wild plant community, and have those interactions intact, I think it's a very hard case to make that we need to be using plants that have deviated substantially. Another thing that's important to avoid are substantial leaf changes. This is research from Kramer and others. Doug Tallamy was involved in this research. And what they found is that really like 25% of cultivars right off the bat were variegated, had permanent leaf color changes, and that is really going to dramatically interact or affect the way that plants interact with their floral hosts. For instance, when you have a variegated leaf and it's pale, those plants are missing chlorophyll in those sections of the leaf. The chlorophyll is the dominant green sort of pigment in plants. Obviously that's how they fix sunlight. But also what's really important about that is that the enzymes in the chloroplast, particularly rubisco, can make up like something like 60% of all the protein content in the leaf. So when you have variegated leaves in the landscape that are not naturally that way, you may be inducing more herbivory, but the herbivory might be in response to that being a very low nutrient sort of profile leaf. So in general, if we can minimize the amount of cultivars that we're using in a restoration project, that is probably beneficial from an ecological standpoint. In terms of how we want to do restoration, this Middleton paper is worth a look. Again, send me an email. I'll leave my contact info at the end, but I'm very happy to send it. I have it as a PDF saved. But what they really see is that getting plants and not just seeds back into a site tends to be associated with better results early on, as well as more durable results long term. You do tend to see sites that are seed-based only, and this is backed up by my own experience looking at these sites, having seen them been done around here at numerous sites in Virginia, that you tend to lose a lot of that fecundity from the site, and it tends to resemble unrestored sort of post-agricultural or disturbed fields, whereas a carefully tended replanted site that may or may not make use of seed as well as part of your restoration uh, efforts will tend to look a little bit better, and I think be more resilient and be more durable. As we talk about provenance, again, this is one of these reasons I always think it's worthwhile sourcing as locally as you can. And I know that not everyone has a local plant nursery, but it may be useful to work with local landowners to even grow a little bit, collect a little bit of seed to support restoration efforts, even if they can't be the bulk of the seed. This is research done in Germany. Bukharova, I'm sorry, I forget her first name, has published a few papers on this, but this 2016 one is fascinating. And really what they found is that with a common meadow species, this is black knapweed, I believe, or a common knapweed that's a common constituent in native meadows in Germany. What they found is that herbivores of it were more likely to visit and feed on ones that had a more local provenance than ones that were wild type but had a less local provenance, and that interaction tended to increase as you went up a trophic level, so that insect predators that were looking for those insect herbivores to eat were far more likely to be hunting on local provenance plants than non-local provenance plants. So, those ecological interactions can continue to persist as you move up a trophic level, as you continue to interact with wildlife on site, which is why I think that's such an important component of restoration practice. I think it's really important to consider your site in how you are doing replanting. So you may find that you want to just do what you would call a sort of plantation-based replanting. I think that's a really great technique for small scale spaces where you can just go into a small space, you can plant it out, basically do something on every square yard, and just get the native stuff that you want back in. I think that especially if you have a really, really good result with initial removal of invasive species, you're not seeing those things come back, say, in a subsequent season or a subsequent year, that planting very densely on a small scale can be a really effective way of moving in quickly and restoring a site. On larger sites, I'm a big advocate of applied nucleation, where maybe you're doing something across the site, maybe you're spreading seed, maybe on a forested context, you're just allowing the trees to come back up. But then you're picking pockets within a site and planting them back out densely and diversely and allowing those things to come back up. This applied nucleation strategy, it's a little bit similar to, say, like Miyawaki Gardens and things like that. It was really born out of lower cost forest restoration techniques that were developed in Central and Latin America. And the idea is to kind of get in, maybe plant, say, 15, 20, 25% of a space instead of 100% of the space. So there is a cost reduction component to this. But there's also a habitat heterogeneity compound to this. So, excuse me, I'm gonna get a drink of water here. So what we see with applied nucleation is, because you're only planting out pockets, you have some species that are growing up ahead that are getting older, and then you have some that are younger and still coming back up. That more closely mimics what we see on older growth, late successional sites, where you have a mix of age classes. Granted, it won't give you an old growth, late successional perfect forest, absolutely not. But it can set the scene for something that is a little bit more heterogeneous on site, and in general, heterogeneous habitat is going to be higher quality habitat, simply because there are more niches to interact with other plants and with wildlife on site. You may also be able to reduce the amount of invasive species that are coming back up. And you may be able to use those nucleated spots. You can choose where it is you want to replant densely to exploit gradients of habitat or microhabitat on site, So you could do some that are upslope, some that are mid-slope, some that are at the bottom of the slope to ensure that you're replanting a wide variety of plants in regards to the kind of moisture they want. Maybe you have little swales on sites. Maybe you have rockier areas that you want to exploit. It can also be a good way if you have deer management problems, and I think that's a problem for most of us along the eastern seaboard here. So that can mean that you're caging, a few sections of an area en masse and planting in that, rather than, say, caging trees individually. We've had really good luck doing this in regard to herbaceous plants in forested communities. So now we have a method for, say, protecting woodland phlox or even terrestrial orchids that were being damaged by deer and invasives that we didn't have elsewhere. I think this also plays into how you are managing ongoing invasives. If you have an area of a restored section that is going to need some further kind of control, whether that's manual, mechanical, or chemical kind of control, you can begin replanting in pockets outside of there. I also think for individually led or volunteer led activities where you're depending on a lot of manual work, just going back in and hand pulling, that planting all together and then making those your priority for going back and pulling out those species can be a really effective way of reducing the amount of labor on site for protecting your investment of plants. So a few of these, this is a photo of woodland phlox growing in our nursery that I just mentioned that we've had good luck with protecting in cages. But these are all things that I think of as really effective tools to use in your restoration, effective techniques to use. And I think that these apply to any kind of restoration modality that you may be working on. That you want to prep ahead of time, that you want to limit your soil disturbance as best as you can. I think all of those things will help create a better and more resilient outcome long term. Beyond planting, I think that management is a huge, huge component of success, especially as you get onto long-term time horizons, whether once you start getting outside of, say, the initial 3 to 5 years, where you might be doing, successive rounds of planting at that point, moving away from that and doing management. There are a lot of species, especially as we talk about our prairie and meadow sort of species that do require disturbance. This is a phenomenal stand locally of Asclepias tuberosa, that is butterfly weed, a species that we're seeing in decline locally, in part because meadow disturbance is primarily mowing. It would prefer to be burned, but that the mowing is badly out of sync with other habitats. So these stands don't pollinate each other, and they don't have the same kind of connectivity that one would want. So being able to sync those things up, there are prairie restorationists out west that have been working with landowners to spot burn rare milkweeds all together, all at the same time, so they can be cross-pollinated. This kind of gets to a lot of different sites, right? So that kind of ongoing management, that could be a part of forest practice. You may, at a time down the line, say, maybe I want to cut back some of our black locust, or maybe I need to thin a sumac stand, or thin a red cedar stand to allow later successional species to begin coming back in. Obviously, if you're managing a grassland, some kind of regular burning or mowing is going to need to be a component of your practice. And I think that there's a really important component, this should be done in the planning stage, but I think that an important component of a successful restoration is deciding where to restore. You may need to be in a situation where you need to pick up an early win. And so taking an area that's already low value, that isn't used by people, that's maybe part of it, like sort of an eyesore. This field was a compacted, muddy pit. before we went in and planted this. That's my mom and now retired landscape architect Susie Foster with our Department of Public Works here in Fairfax. And this was a seed and replanting based effort here in what's now sort of a moist to wet meadow site with a pretty high degree of diversity, both of plants and interesting wildlife using it. This wasn't used for parking. It wasn't used for ball fields. It wasn't used for anything. It was just ugly before, and now it's really, really cool. And those are the kind of sites that can really develop, and create allies for conservation and for restoration. As you can see here, we're underneath a lot of power lines on this site, so we could not have taller components of the landscape, add trees and things back in. So we really had to focus on an herbaceous plant community just to meet all those requirements. But that has been a durable intervention in the landscape. I really think it's important to continue replanting. My rule of thumb is think about replanting being a 3-year effort. One of that is that you can really limit the effect of what we call year effects on a site. So what that means is if you get a bad drought 1 year, that may kill a lot of seedlings that are drought sensitive that may be more drought resilient had they had a couple years to grow in. What ecologists find who study these sort of things is that year effects during establishment phases for a lot of plants can have a really long-lasting impact. So you may be permanently damaging the potential biodiversity on a site in terms of the plants if you do not replant after that sort of failure. So I really encourage folks to, go back to a site 1 year post initial planting and say, what succeeded, what didn't, and see if there's patterns for what didn't. Was it because of some disturbance on site? Was it because of drought? Was it because of too much rain? And then think about, hey, maybe I should replant some of those. It may be that this is still the right site, but we had a weird year in regards to their establishment, and to try again. That will give you long term a more resilient site, a more diverse sort of site. And that's exactly what I think that applied nucleation can get you in. You can nucleate over a few years and again, really control those costs. I think that incorporating regeneration and success and natural succession on restoration sites is another way of, one, reducing costs, but also building natural biodiversity. So this site on the left is in Dyke Marsh. It's along the Potomac. There are elements of, or there are still tidal wetlands there. There are also forested habitat there. This is great habitat. In fact, right where this is taken is not too far from a bald eagle's nest that you could go to now that's still active. But a huge amount of the diversity that Ned from Friends of Dyke Marsh is standing by is stuff that we didn't plant. That big, tall, yellow-flowered plant, that Smolanthus ovidalis, that came up on its own. Most of that blue mist flower in the foreground came up on its own. A lot of the deer tongue grass that's low-growing, that came up on its own. Surprising no one that has it in its native range. There's a lot of pokeweed that came up. There's also our native yellow passion flower, an herbaceous vine growing in the trees in the back. We still replanted, but we targeted the species we were growing to add diversity rather than duplicate what was naturally occurring on site. There may be cases where you want to duplicate what's already growing on site. We sometimes do that if all of a certain species came out of a seed mix. Hey, let's put in a little bit of our natural diversity on site, get that back in, as well to insulate and to have that kind of genetic diversity happening. But working with a natural seed bank, a natural bud bank, can really reduce the lift in terms of how much work you have to put in. At this other site here, this is Windmill Hill Park in Old Town in Alexandria here. Again, this is a stone's throw from the Potomac, but a much drier site. You can see that there are historic elements here, a stacked stone wall. There is a tunnel here for a pedestrian and bike tunnel that goes under a road. This is also a very steep embankment. This was really badly invaded. This was forestry mulch, so they were a thick layer of chips. And when we went to replant, we just planted right into the chips. We didn't worry about it. And we planted a real mix, including successional trees. The idea was that this site could never be mowed, at least not safely. It's too steep. It is not something that you want folks on mower decks, whether that's a tractor with a pull behind mower or a ride-on mower, or even, like a push style mower, because there's a high risk of that flipping over, that injuring people. So again, we're looking at the human element of the site as well as the ecological element here. And so what we did is we planted out a pretty diverse successional sort of meadow, but we included sumacs in the mix with the idea that the sumacs would success and take over the site. So if you go to Windmill Hill Park now, there's a lot, it's basically just a dense stand of sumac, which is what the land manager there intended to happen. Maybe long term, there's been a change in who the land manager is, but maybe in the long term, there's another stage to go around where maybe we thin sumacs and we plant some other species in there. But we had a number of years of good ecological value with the meadow and herbaceous components, and it continues to create a lot of ecological value for birds and other things, with it being more or less a dense sumac stand as well. And then just to sort of wrap up on what I hope is sort of a hopeful message here, is that we largely cannot go back and undo what have been really the last couple centuries of really abusive practices to our landscape, that have really marred the quality and extent of our natural areas across really all of North America. And again, this is a story repeated across the world. But we can work with a lot of the stock that we have here. There are a lot of woodlands that are otherwise pretty degraded. You can see in this stand with Katie and a couple of our seasonal interns from a year past that that is a state rare purple milkweed. That's the same species that was on my title slide, growing in this wet forest. And there's a lot of stilt grass. There is also native white cut grass in there, but there's also some significant invasion. But we still see rare species persisting in there that are really waiting for us to go back in there and do some control and sort of take that stressor away from the landscape. I think that's the case anywhere that people work, where we have these fragments, that we can go in and we can make a difference. I think especially in the face of climate change and a lot of other nasty environmental stressors that we have a lot less control over on a local scale, that creating more habitat and more resilient habitat is a really, really exciting way that we can get back in and ensure that we have landscape that will be around for future generations. And as a parent myself, with a daughter who will be 3 in June, I feel this very strongly. I feel it in my bones that it is our duty to go back in and to protect those areas and restore them. And I think that there's a lot of research that suggests that there's a lot of room for ecological uplift to still happen, that it is absolutely not too late, and that we should not feel a sort of doom and gloom attitude towards our management of natural lands. So that about covers it for what I wanted to go through here. I wanted to leave really ample time to go through my slides and or to answer folks' questions. Please do feel free to send me an email. If you go to our website, all our staff emails are on the email page. You can just go to earthsangha.org/staff. And do please look at our compendium. It's a resource about all the plants that we grow, talks about some of our local plant communities that we see here in Northern Virginia. If you're farther afield and need help locating some of those resources, I really recommend, resource across North America. Things like NatureServe can be really, really great for looking at plant communities. Look at your state's Department of Conservation and Recreation or their Natural Heritage Program. In Virginia, we have a phenomenal natural heritage program, some of the best research, into our plant communities, and that can really be the guide for what you want to replant in your natural areas. So, great. Without further ado, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Maddie. That was so inspirational. And I don't know if I'm the only one who got sort of tears in my eyes when you were talking about native plants just waiting for us to come in there. They're just waiting for us to come in and help so they can thrive. Um, One thing I wanted to start with is I think there might be a lot of people in our audience who have kind of these backyard lots in suburban Virginia or suburban in their town, and maybe for the first time have just pulled some invasive plants out of their yard. For someone like that who is just kind of starting, can you take us through just like what are the first couple steps would you tell them to do to they're feeling a little overwhelmed. They just pulled this stuff up. Should they wait and just see what comes up? Or, go find an organization like you or a native plant nursery to talk to? What are just some first steps if you had to, if, for some people who just want to know what they should do at the very beginning?
So I would say that it's always beneficial in restoration, especially in small spaces, if it's your yard or something like that, to really think top down about replanting, right?
Okay.
One that kind of helps shape the space, just from like a design perspective. But I think that it makes it easier to sort of play defense, if you will. So if you are just getting started and you have, just lawn or common garden invasives, you have a field full of vinca or a field of English ivy, not much else. Get some native trees back in, plant an oak tree or two or something like that. Even if you maybe already have one oak tree, especially in urban areas, it is rare to see oak trees live beyond, say, 100 years old, even though they could potentially live to 300, 400, 500 years old. So getting a tree seedling in, keeping vines off of it, getting it established is a really great first priority. Then over time, you can begin kind of adding a little bit of mulch around it, destroying some of the lawn there, replanting with native things. One of the things I also recommend, I did a whole other presentation about this for the Loudon Wildlife Conservancy, is thinking about ecotones at home. So that is a transition from one plant community type to another. And I think that suburbia is kind of perfect for this, right? Think about planting sunny grassland species, things that you'd find in a meadow in your front yard. You don't have to turn your front yard into a meadow, though certainly you could. That's what our yard looks like. But use some of those species in the front, put some shrubs and smaller trees along the sides, your side yard or the beginning of your backyard, and put some canopy trees in the back. That is the foundation to having a transition from meadow to forest in your yard that will give you a wide range of habitat over time to play around with and will allow you to maximize diversity over time. But really feel free to experiment, get a few different things. There are species that grow quick that you can divide and move elsewhere in your garden. If you're local to us and you've never divided a plant, come volunteer. We're open Sunday, Mondays, and Wednesday mornings. We will teach you how to divide plants so then you don't have to come back every year and get more golden ragwort or more mountain mint. You can get one or two and be good for the rest of your life.
Well, I would say that even if they're not local, there might be a few people that might drive up to you to teach them to divide plants. I might be one of them. But okay, moving on. I think Lauren has a question for you.
Yeah, so Liza Mormon from the Glenmore Invasive Warriors would like to know, so if you're living in an HOA and you've been working at removing invasive plants from, for example, a common woodland area, how do you balance understanding that there's a bias towards waiting for to see what rebounds from the seed bank and a bias toward um, restoring within the natural plant community? How do you balance that against maybe the greater HOA's desire for aesthetics while you're waiting in that restoration period? Like where can you meet everyone's needs? What would you
So
recommend?
I would say that restoring an herbaceous plant community, whether you're talking about a forest understory and having that look sort of lush and full of plants, I will remind folks, especially folks in the Piedmont, that is not what most of our forest understories, even in high quality forests, look like. We have bare earth. We have areas just of leaf litter. That's what they're supposed to look like. But that restoring an herbaceous plant community is probably the hardest challenge in terms of restoration, especially in high visibility areas where you need to get the aesthetics just right. If you are committed to doing something like that, you want to create a pocket meadow, sort of things like that, it is worth the time to consult with a designer or something like that. You may need to use some kind of seed. In general, I wouldn't recommend an off-the-shelf seed mix, something that just says, oh yeah, Virginia meadow mix. That's probably not going to be good enough. Think about getting a few species that emerge early and then planting in with that. So maybe get some black-eyed Susan seed, or maybe get some partridge pea seed, and use that and plant throughout. But in general, I would say trees and shrubs can make a big difference to how the area is perceived. In terms of replanting, my rule of thumb is, especially if you have a persistent ground cover, so say you're removing English ivy, you probably want to wait at least a year to begin replanting herbaceous species back into the space. And that's because what we tend to see, and I'm sure other members of the PRISM have seen this too, is that you can remove a carpet of English ivy and then get a lot of siltgrass to come back up. Now that's not the end of the world. You can control siltgrass, you can control garlic mustard. But it's going to be a lot easier to control it if you're not working around a whole bunch of establishing asters and things like that that you just planted back in. So getting those trees and shrubs back into the landscape can make a big difference. And I would say, as you're addressing the human components of the landscape, do not let perfect be the enemy of good. When you're talking about HOA controlled areas, you're going to have to play by their rules. There's not a lot you can do unless you are willing to run for HOA president and begin, tearing apart people's bylaws. So if what that means is, hey, we removed a few of the most noxious invasive species, we planted a few more trees, but they are going to mow underneath them, then that is maybe what success looks like in that space. And that can be okay. You added, those trees are performing more ecological values. It's getting better. We cannot turn every square inch of the planet back into lush natural areas as much as, like, I personally would like to be able to do that.
That's a really great point. Thank you. I think especially for beginners, when you're first introduced to what's going on with invasive plants and native plants, you're just so afraid of making a mistake that it can kind of freeze you, and you don't know what to do next. But that is, just do your best and try not to be perfect. That's a great piece of advice, Maddie. Thank you.
That has absolutely been the case from my experience. So
Yeah.
I've been working full time at Earth Sangha since 2011. I've worked at a lot of different sites, and I don't think I can go to a single one, even ones that have happened, in the last few years, and not think that, hey, there's something that I would change about how I approach this site, which is why I like to give these talks. But also that, you will just develop that expertise yourself, and there's no way to develop expertise without making a few mistakes, right? So, it's important to go to these meetings and meet people, join your local native plant society, join your master naturalist chapter, go to Blue Ridge Prism, or if you have another prism locally, and get involved with that, because that's where the practitioners hang out. That's where you'll begin to learn what works and what doesn't work. The experience of our colleagues at local parks authorities, at Public Works Department, or stormwater, soil and water folks, that's been huge for helping me develop my own expertise. And I'd like to think that I've helped some of those folks along the way too.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, that there is community waiting for you to come join and talk about these things. So I know that we are always at Prism happy to answer any of your questions. And I know Earth Sangha definitely has a thriving community that just likes to hang out over there and talk with each other. Natalie, did you have a question? I saw that you marked a few that you wanted to ask Maddie from the audience.
So the first question in the Q&A is about recommended planting after removal of lesser celandine. And to add on to that, someone was asking, they have lesser celandine and native spring ephemerals in the same habitat. They would love to lobby for biocontrol for the species. Any native plants able to coexist with it in the meantime? Any successful perennials able to reclaim the areas?
So I think that tackling lesser celandine is going to be very, very challenging. I would recommend, unless it's like, in very incipient invasion where maybe you have just like a shovel full to scoop out, avoid trying to do that mechanically at all. The rule of thumb, and again, look at Blue Ridge PRISM's fact sheets for these species. But the rule of thumb that I've seen a lot of park managers use is that you want to budget for 7 years of potential control if you're going to seriously make a dent and begin to replace those things. So it's a significant undertaking. It's absolutely worth doing if you can do that. I would say that chemical controls have to be sort of part of your toolkit if you're going to really make a difference in an area with significant lesser salandine invasion. You will likely want to work with a professional applicator along the mid-Atlantic. Most folks are working with IPC, that is Invasive Plant Control. They're based in Tennessee, I believe, but they do work all over the place. They're going to have the right tools for the job, and including like the kind of surfactants and additives that they would add there. I'm not a certified pesticide applicator, so that is not specifically my field of expertise. So, find an expert and work with them. But especially working in a wetland context, you're going to want to be very careful about potential harms to amphibians and fish and other plant material. And working with a trusted and certified expert is the best way to avoid that. In terms of replanting, we do see a lot of spring ephemerals that can still exist in some way with lesser salandine. I think over time, they do tend to crowd them out. It may not be the most exciting species, so it may be things like, say, skunk cabbage, right? I would think a lot of our wetland sedges are other good components there. At least locally, what we see in a lot of these swamp forests with a lot of lesser salandine, and it's not driven by lesser salandine, but other stressors of the landscape, is that we see a lot of tree decline happening. Our green ash is broadly in decline. We continue to grow green ash for replanting for purposes out here. We think that eventually we may sort of hit a tipping point with some resilience. But even if we don't, just from our native population, we can at least keep that genetic diversity that we see perpetuating forward, which I think is important in and of itself. Getting other wetland understory shrubs and trees back in can be really important and add a lot of diversity back in. There's research out of Pennsylvania that suggests simply the amount of cover of arrowwood viburnum, which is one of our most common viburnums in moist to wet forests throughout the mid-Atlantic, is a driver of success for about 60 species of migratory bird. So simply getting those back into that kind of landscape can be a big factor in terms of its ecological value. So even if it's really slow going on the herbaceous level, there's a lot of intervention that I think that can be done in an area with significant lesser salandine invasion. The other thing I would mention is before you start spraying, figure out where the salandine is coming from, move upstream as much as possible. It is probably a waste of time given how the bulblets and things like that move around. If your backyard backs up to a big invasion and you're only controlling your backyard, and you can look upstream and see acres of this stuff, I don't think that that would be worth it to start spraying, because that would probably be a more like a sort of forever sort of management.
Okay, so it sounds like there's like a Sisyphus thing going on there if you're not looking, if there's an upstream problem. Thank you. Jim, do you have a question that for Maddie from the audience? Okay, he has connectivity issues sometimes with his internet, so he might not have access right now. Lauren, do you want to share one?
We have a question from Laura Greenleaf. What experience do you have or research on the use of hydroseeding for rehabbing an area after extensive invasive removal, specifically urban park settings, including eroded steep slopes? Limited information that she could find suggests it could be a good method in theory, but with caveats, including possible incompatibility, etc. So do you have experience to share about hydroseeding on slopes?
We've only been involved in hydroseeding in a few cases. So those were really, we were working with National Park Service to provide some seed for areas that were otherwise inaccessible for other types of work. So they used hydro seeding. A lot of the meadows that we've worked on that have been seeded have been drill seeded instead of hydro seeded. We've even worked on restorations where their seed has been hand broadcast. Or we've even talked about the potential of simply haying another field when the seed is available and spreading that back out onto a new meadow. So we might be trying that at a few sites, working with our partners on that. I think seed in general is a really important tool. I think that especially if you're using a native seed mix or local provenance seed, that that could be a really important way of going back in. I am, for obvious reasons, rather biased towards going in and doing a plant-based restoration. I think some of my slides earlier kind of went into some of those reasons why that I think that that is a durable intervention. But certainly large-scale reseeding can be really important. Working with some of our colleagues in the Park Authority who have done a lot of work in reseeding, what we tend to see is that getting your seed mix dialed in is really important. So especially if you're mixing a whole bunch of species in there, there can simply be an understanding of working with those machines that some seeds are too big or too small. And that has had difficulty. I know that like covering large, sometimes heterogeneous areas with the same seed mix over time can be really difficult. I know that like say, those plantings that have been, or those seedings that have been done locally on capped meadows, that some of that can be a little bit tricky, in part because those aren't yet well-established native soils either. It's fill dirt that is being used for the cap. So part of the difficulty in reseeding really degraded sites is not just the seed itself, but that it just takes time for a site to go through succession and give you the mycorrhizal, the fungal, and even the bacterial components that help a meadow get established. In some cases, if your seed mix has too many early emerging species, so you used a mix that has, say, too much Rudbeckia hirta, too much partridge pea, if there are non-native rye species that are used in there as cover, and that balance is out of whack, you can get a site that kind of gets locked up for the first year or two with a monoculture and not a lot else emerging out. Then after those die out, the other seed may or may not emerge how you want it to. So there's a lot of nuance that goes specifically into that sort of work. One of the folks that we worked with is Owen Williams. He is now on the West Coast. He's continuing to be a working ecologist, but he has a lot of seed-based expertise and work. I'm happy, I don't know his email address off the top of my head, but I'm happy to send that to the Blue Ridge folks to share with folks too. I'm sure he would be happy to help folks dial in their seed mixes.
Great. Oh, were you going to follow through on that, Lauren?
I was just going to say, if I could toss in an additional, I think several questions came up that are related. If you could talk about, in your applied nucleation technique, can you describe the fencing that you use, and then when can you remove deer protection from these areas or from trees and shrubs? How long does that have to be up for?
So in our practice, we've been using welded wire fence and metal T-posts. We prefer that because the goal for us is to not introduce any more plastics into our soils and environment than they're already suffused with. Those are pretty sturdy. They can have a lifespan of easily more than 10 years if they're installed properly and you use enough posts. We are doing 6-foot tall welded wire fencing, to be extra certain about deer, especially for our larger, say, 100, 150 foot circumference, nuclei. There are other ways of doing this. So say Fairfax County, our stormwater folks are using 4-foot tall fencing. And their nuclei, the nuclei they're installing are oval shaped rather than circles, right? The benefit of doing an oval when you're doing a shorter fence is that deer can still hop into a 4-foot tall fence, but because it feels confining, if you get that oval narrow enough, they will tend to want to spend less time in there. So you still get the benefit of having the planted things in there regenerating quicker. In any case, whether you're using 6-foot tall, which is very heavy, a 50-foot roll, weighs like 70 pounds or something. So you might need a couple people to haul that in. Into a space and to get that installed. We found that our caging costs on a per stem basis dropped by about 75 to 80%. So a really substantial cost savings, and that is not counting the amount of herbaceous plant material we're able to protect. Now, when you remove the fencing is really going to depend on what kind of deer browse you have and what you are planting in. There are certainly sites that we're doing this where we know that the deer herd is concentrated in the park where we're working. And because we're trying to protect threatened herbaceous species as well as woody tree species, that we see the cage as kind of a permanent part of the landscape, that we're just going to leave that in there. We'll continue to make repairs. Again, these last for a long time, so you can amortize those costs over a long period. However, if you are doing primarily woody tree things that the deer browse is really just on the youngest trees, I would think about removing them when your highest value targets are large enough diameter that they are not at risk of a lot of deer antler rub. So as you start to get to beyond a sort of 1-inch DBH. Again, there are ways that you can minimize that risk too, say planting shrubs and multi-stemmed elements on the outside of your nuclei can help. So if you say you have hazelnut and that's appropriate for that, once hazelnut gets established, it puts out a lot of different stems. It doesn't really mind if the outer stems get a lot of antler rub on them. The core of the plant is protected, and that can be a buffer to say your oaks and your hickories that you really want to protect from antler rub. So that may be a way to reuse that material to jump to another nucleation, say maybe in 4 to 5 years or things like that.
That's a great answer. I hadn't thought about strategically putting a certain tree or kind of on the outside to protect the inner trees. Thank you. So your answers to these questions have been incredible, Maddie. Thank you so much. I could have asked you many, many more. I know many people had a lot more questions, but we are at 101, and I want to respect people's time. And so we just really want to thank you again, Maddie, for being here with Blue Ridge PRISM. It was really enlightening to hear all of the information you have to share with us. And I know a lot of people will probably be stopping by your Sangha to learn more and talk with you in person. And it was just really an inspiring talk. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. And I know that there are probably folks who will want recording, that are either in the thing and missed something I said, but also, I know that there are folks in our network who couldn't make it, who wanted to see it. How best should we access the recording of the presentation?
So I will be sending out an email to everyone who registered with a link to the recording and all of the relevant information that perhaps we touched on that they might want to just be able to follow the links to that. So they will get that, no worries. But moving on to our next quarterly meeting, we've got one coming up on July 16th. And we got a lot of questions actually from people from neighborhoods who are interested in what to do in their situations. I know Lauren read one. And so we're really happy to be presenting a presentation focused on working together, how neighborhood associations are addressing invasive plants in their communities. So the sign up for that has just opened up. So be an early bird and get your spot now. This will be for July 16th this summer at 11:30, and we'll have 3 representatives from 3 different HOAs in the state. Will be talking with us about the pros and cons and what's worked for them and what hasn't, informing groups that are dealing with invasive plants. Finally, I just want to once again thank Maddie and thank all of you for your support for Blue Ridge Prism's programs. We wouldn't be able to offer these free programs without your support. And so if you would be interested at all in supporting our work financially, we will be forever grateful. And you can donate to us at blueridgeprism.org/donate. Any other information you'd like about Blue Ridge Prism's fact sheets or events or about our history, and to sign up for a site visit, go ahead and go to our website, blueridgeprism.org. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to email us at info@blueridgeprism.org. We are on lots of different social media platforms. The ones we're most active on are on Facebook and Instagram, and we've just started out on Blue Sky in the past few months, so you can find us on there as well. And then finally, we are always interested in getting volunteers to help us with our many different tasks. So again, contact us at info@blueridgeprism.org if you have any questions or want to volunteer. And as Maddie asked, the recording of this webinar will be emailed to you in a few days. So sit tight and you'll be hearing from me. And that's it. Thank you for joining us. There will be a short survey that pops up right after you get out of this, after you exit this. And if you could just take 5 minutes to answer it, that will help us better serve you in the future to provide webinars that are of interest to you. So we really appreciate it. We went a little bit over. It's 1:05 now. Thank you for sticking with us. Thank you again to Maddie for this wonderful information, and to the panelists, Lauren, Natalie, Jim, and Jacob, who joined us at the end for answering questions. And with that, I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your week. And it's turned into a beautiful day here in Virginia. So I hope you enjoy the sunshine. Thank you.
Thank you.